Okay, so this time you guys sent in a bunch of research on working memory training programs. And, those claims you see that they can, like, supercharge your kid's brain and make them better learners in school.
Yeah. And it's a really hot topic right now with a ton of interest from parents and educators. So it's super important to figure out, what the research actually says.
Right, exactly, because there's a lot of hype out there. So we want to cut through that in this deep dive and see what the evidence really tells us about these working memory training programs. And, do they actually make a difference in how kids learn, especially in subjects like reading and math?
Right. And to get started, I think it's really important to make sure everyone's on the same page about, what working memory actually is.
Okay, so, like, how would you explain it based on the research we have?
Well, the sources basically describe it as the system in your brain that, you know, holds information for a short period of time. Like when you're working on a task or trying to solve a problem, it's like that mental workspace you use to keep things in mind.
Okay, yeah, so it's not just like your long-term memory, it's that active part of your memory that's holding and manipulating information right now.
Exactly. And one of the really fascinating things is that there's a strong connection between a child's working memory and their academic performance. Like kids with better working memory tend to do better in school.
That makes sense. It's like having more mental horsepower to tackle those learning challenges.
Right. And what's even more interesting is that researchers have observed that children who struggle with reading or math, or even those with ADHD, often have difficulties with working memory.
So it's like a common thread that runs through a lot of different learning challenges.
Yeah, exactly. And that's kind of led to this idea that, if we can improve a child's working memory, maybe we can help them overcome some of those academic hurdles.
Yeah, so the thinking is boost the underlying ability and you'll see improvements in all these different areas that rely on it.
Right. And that's basically the core principle behind all these working memory training programs. The idea that you can train and strengthen working memory capacity, and that this will somehow lead to not only better memory, but also improvements in learning behavior in the classroom.
But I think it's important to, differentiate between what they call near transfer and far transfer, right?
Yeah, that's a really crucial distinction. So near transfer basically means that, a child gets better at tasks that are really similar to the ones they were training on. Like if they practice remembering longer and longer sequences of numbers and they get better at that, that's near transfer.
Right. So they improve on something that looks a lot like the training itself. But what we really care about is that far transfer, right? Like,
Mhm.
does this training actually lead to improvements in completely different skills, like reading comprehension or problem solving or even, focusing better in class?
Right. Exactly. And that's the big promise that these programs are making. But one of the sources actually brings up a really important point about what it really means when someone improves on a working memory task. Like they give this example of someone who got really good at remembering long strings of digits, like way better than average.
Okay, like a memory athlete kind of thing.
Yeah, but it turned out they were using a very specific memory strategy, like a mnemonic device. And while their digit recall went through the roof, their overall memory capacity for other types of information didn't actually improve.
So they basically learned a trick for that one specific task, but it didn't actually enhance their underlying working memory ability.
Yeah, exactly. And that's a super important distinction to keep in mind because, we do see this correlation between working memory and academic success, but that doesn't automatically mean that training working memory will directly cause those academic improvements, especially in kids with learning difficulties.
It might be that something else is contributing to both the working memory issue and the academic struggles.
Right. And that's why we need to look closely at the research to see if there's really a causal link.
So let's talk about some of these real world applications like CogMed. That's probably the most well-known program out there.
Right. CogMed and there are others, and they typically involve these computerized exercises where kids have to remember sequences of things like numbers or visual patterns, and the difficulty kind of adjusts based on how well they're doing.
Yeah, and these programs are often based on different types of memory tasks, like those memory span tasks where you have to remember a list of items in order, or maybe backwards, or those N-back tasks where you have to remember what you saw a few steps ago.
Yeah, and then there are the complex sum span tasks, which are even trickier because you're trying to remember a sequence while also doing something else at the same time.
So it's like juggling multiple mental balls at once.
Exactly, and you see these types of exercises not just in these specialized programs, but also in some popular brain training apps like Brain Twister or Lumosity.
Right. And the companies behind these programs and sometimes even the media have made some pretty big claims about huge improvements in things like arithmetic, spelling, reading comprehension, and even benefits for kids with ADHD.
And while some early research seemed to show some promise, those findings haven't really held up as more rigorous studies have been conducted.
Right. It seems like the scientific community has gotten a lot more skeptical, and they've developed some really important criteria for evaluating the quality of this research.
Absolutely. And one of the sources actually lays out some key things to look for when you're trying to figure out, is this working memory training really effective or is it all hype?
Okay, so what are some of those red flags or things that signal a really good study versus one that might not be so reliable?
So the first and probably most important thing is the use of active control groups.
Okay, so can you explain that a little bit more? Why are active control groups so important in this type of research?
So imagine you have a group of kids who are doing the working memory training, and you're comparing them to a group who doesn't do anything special. They're just, you know, going about their normal routine. That would be a passive control group.
Right, so one group gets the training, the other group doesn't, and then you see who improves more.
But the problem with that is that there are so many other things that could be different between those groups, besides just the training itself. Like maybe the kids in the training group are getting more attention from researchers, or maybe they're more motivated because they know they're part of this special program.
Right, so it's not just the training itself, it's all these other factors that could be influencing the results.
Exactly. And that's why active control groups are so important, because these kids are also doing something during the study. But it's not the working memory training. It's something else that's designed to be engaging and keep them, mentally active. But it's not targeting working memory specifically.
So it's like a more fair comparison because both groups are getting some kind of intervention or stimulation.
Exactly. And if the training group still shows more improvement than the active control group, then you can be more confident that it's the training itself that's making the difference, not just all these other factors.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And the source actually mentions a meta-analysis that found working memory training seemed to improve nonverbal intelligence when compared to passive control groups. But when they looked at studies with active control groups, that effect disappeared.
Right. So that really highlights how crucial it is to have that active comparison group to make sure you're actually measuring the impact of the training itself.
And another thing the source emphasizes is the importance of large sample sizes. Why is that so
Mhm.
critical?
Well, when you only have a small number of participants in a study, it's much easier to get results that just happen by chance. Like maybe you just happen to get a group of kids who are already improving anyway.
Right, so it's like flipping a coin a few times. You might get heads a bunch of times in a row, but that doesn't mean the coin is biased.
Exactly. And larger sample sizes help to kind of even out those random fluctuations and give you a more accurate picture of whether the training program is actually having a consistent effect.
So it's like the more data you have, the more confident you can be in the findings.
And the source suggests that, you really want to see at least 20 participants in each group, both the training group and the control group. And you want to measure them before and after the training to see if there's been any real change.
Okay, so that's a good rule of thumb to keep in mind when you're looking at these studies.
Right. And another thing to consider is the use of objective measures as opposed to just relying on subjective reports, like asking teachers or parents, do you think the child has improved?
Yeah, because those reports can be really influenced by people's expectations, right?
Exactly. Like if a teacher knows a child's been doing this working memory training, they might be more likely to see improvements, even if those changes are really subtle or maybe not even there.
Right, it's like the power of suggestion.
And that's why it's so important to use objective measures like standardized tests of reading or math, because those are less likely to be biased by people's expectations.
Right, so you want to see hard data, not just anecdotal evidence.
Yeah, exactly. And the source actually mentions a meta-analysis on ADHD that showed behavioral ratings improved when the person doing the rating knew who had received the training, but not when they were blinded to that information.
So that's a pretty clear example of how our expectations can shape what we see.
And of course, we also want to see evidence of near transfer, that the training is actually improving the specific working memory skills it's targeting. But as we've talked about, that's not enough on its own.
Right, that just tells you the training is working on a basic level, but what we're really interested in is that FAR-BAR is FAR transfer health to those broader improvements in academic skills.
Exactly. And this source points out that the pattern of transfer results needs to make sense. Like ideally, you want to see that the training and control groups are starting at a similar level before the training, and then the training group shows a much bigger improvement.
Right. And sometimes you might see studies where there's a statistically significant difference between groups, but it's because the control group actually got worse over time.
Yeah, and that doesn't really tell you much about the training itself. It could just mean that the control group was doing something that was actually detrimental.
So it's like saying a new drug is effective because people who didn't take it got sicker.
Exactly. And for this deep dive, we're really focusing on studies that involve children, where the training is specifically targeted at working memory and where the outcomes are directly relevant to education like performance in reading and math.
Right, because that's ultimately what we care about. Do these programs actually help kids learn better in school?
And with those criteria in mind, the source goes on to review a number of key studies that have used active control groups. So these are the ones that provide the most reliable evidence.
Okay, so let's dive into some of those findings. Let's start with the Alloway et al. Study from 2013. They looked at a program called Jungle Memory.
Right. And what's really interesting about that study is that the training group was actually getting much more frequent training than the active control group. But even with that difference, there was no significant improvement in their spelling or math scores.
And they even followed up with the kids 8 months later and still no significant difference.
So that really starts to challenge the core claims of these programs that, just training working memory will magically translate into better academic performance.
Okay, so what about the Eng et al. Study from 2015? They looked at CogMed, which is, like the big name in working memory training.
Yeah, and that was a really well-designed study with both active and passive control groups and a good number of participants in each group.
So pretty solid study overall.
Right, and they did find that the CogMed group showed near transfer to working memory tasks, so they got better at those specific tasks.
But what about those broader academic skills?
Well, that's where it gets interesting. They found no transfer to 3 different standardized math tests. And in fact, when you look closely at their data, the CogMed group actually showed numerically smaller improvements in math compared to both control groups.
So even though they got better at the working memory tasks, that didn't translate into better math performance.
Exactly. And we're starting to see this pattern across multiple studies now, including ones that look at popular programs like CogMed. The training might improve performance on tasks that are very similar, but it's not really leading to those real-world gains in the classroom subjects that parents and educators care about.
Okay, so that's a pretty consistent finding. Now, what about the Chaco et al. Study from 2014? They specifically looked at children with ADHD using CogMed.
Right, and they actually compared an adaptive version of CogMed to a non-adaptive control version.
Mhm.
So both groups were still doing working memory tasks, but one group was getting that kind of personalized difficulty adjustment.
Okay, so still a fair comparison because both groups were actively engaged.
Exactly, and they found evidence of near transfer again, but no significant improvement on any of the 4 academic tests they used, which covered things like word reading, sentence comprehension, spelling, and math computation.
So across the board, no real academic benefits.
Right, and the researchers actually concluded that CogMed didn't seem to have specific effects on academic achievement in the short term, and they said it shouldn't be recommended as a primary treatment for ADHD in children.
That's a pretty strong statement from the researchers themselves.
Yeah, they were basically saying, don't use this for ADHD. There's no evidence that it works.
Okay, and then there's the Dunning et al. Study from 2013. They also looked at CogMed this time with elementary school students who had identified working memory difficulties.
Right, and this study was really rigorous.
Yeah.
They had both active and passive control groups, a good sample size, and they followed the kids for 12 months.
So they really covered all the bases methodologically.
Yeah, and they found near transfer to working memory measures, but no transfer to a whole range of reading and math outcomes even after a year.
And they actually questioned some earlier findings from their own research group that had been more positive.
Right, they basically said, look, we've improved our methods, and now we're not seeing those same effects.
So it seems like the more carefully these programs are studied, the less support there is for those broad academic benefits.
That's the trend we're seeing. And
Yeah.
there's another study, the Gray et al. Study from 2012, where they compared CogMed to an active math intervention for children with learning disabilities and ADHD.
So instead of just a control group, they had another intervention group that was specifically targeting math skills.
Exactly. And they found no improvement in behavior or academic measures in the CogMed group compared to the group that was getting that direct math intervention.
So again, it seems like targeting the skill directly is more effective than trying to boost it indirectly through working memory training.
And we see this pattern again in the Henry et al. Study from 2013, where they used a face-to-face adaptive training program instead of a computer-based one.
So a more personalized approach, but still focused on working memory.
Right. And they compared that to an active control group, and they found near transfer in the training group, but no significant difference in word reading or number skills over a 12-month period.
So again, that far transfer just wasn't there.
And even the Holmes et al. Study from 2009, which is often cited as evidence for the effectiveness of CogMed, actually has some nuances that are worth noting.
Okay, what do you mean?
Well, in that study, the control group actually showed numerically larger gains in reading and math immediately after the training compared to the adaptive training group.
So the control group did better.
Numerically, yeah. And the authors themselves acknowledged that the adaptive training had little impact on academic skills right after the training ended.
That's interesting. And they only had follow-up data for the training groups. It's hard to compare the long-term effects.
Right. And that brings us to a couple of studies that the source mentions that did have large sample sizes, but they used passive control groups. So the Bergman, Nutley, and Klingberg study from 2014 and the Rode et al. Study from 2014.
And you mentioned earlier why those passive control groups are a limitation.
Exactly. Because you can't rule out those other factors like motivation or attention from researchers that might have contributed to any observed improvements. So in the Bergman, Nutley, and Klingberg study, they did report a significant effect on a math test. But the training and control groups started out with different working memory abilities, and they were tested under different conditions.
So too many other variables that could have skewed the results.
In the Rode et al. Study, they found a small positive effect on only 1 out of 4 reading and math outcomes.
So not exactly a resounding endorsement.
Right. And the researchers themselves concluded that their findings didn't really support the idea that working memory training had substantial educationally meaningful benefits beyond what kids would normally get from regular classroom instruction.
So even with those large sample sizes, the lack of an active comparison group makes it really hard to say for sure that the training was the cause of any improvements.
Exactly. And it all comes back to the main takeaway from this deep dive. The evidence from well-designed studies with active control groups really doesn't support the claim that working memory training leads to significant improvements in children's reading, spelling, and math skills.
And the source does acknowledge that this review was focused specifically on academic achievement and working memory training, so it didn't look at things like IQ scores or behavioral ratings.
Right, and it didn't cover other types of cognitive training or video games, but other reviews that have looked at those outcomes using active control groups haven't generally found significant benefits either.
So it seems like the focus on working memory training as a way to boost academic performance might be misplaced.
And the source actually suggests that future research might be more fruitful if it focuses on training specific skills that are directly relevant to academic outcomes, like, training language skills to improve reading comprehension or using computer-assisted instruction for reading and math.
That makes a lot more sense to me than this idea that you can just train working memory in isolation and it will magically make kids better learners across the board.
And the source also touches on some important real-world implications of this research, like, there's this assumption that working memory training might be most helpful for kids who are struggling. But some studies actually suggest the opposite.
Really? So the kids who need it the most might not benefit as much?
Well, some research indicates that children with higher initial abilities might show bigger gains on the training tasks themselves, which could actually widen the achievement gap.
So it's like the rich get richer.
Yeah. And that's a really concerning possibility. And then there's the issue of cost. These commercial programs can be really expensive, and they require a significant time commitment from kids and educators.
Right, and that time and money could be spent on other things that have a much stronger evidence base.
Exactly. And for a child with ADHD, for example, relying on working memory training instead of proven therapies could be really detrimental.
So it's not just about whether it works, it's also about the opportunity cost. What else could we be doing with those resources?
And the source actually echoes the caution from the Rode et al. Study, saying that we should be really careful about using working memory training programs in schools or clinical settings, given the lack of solid evidence.
So it's not a slam dunk by any means.
Not at all. And to sum up this deep dive, working memory is clearly important for learning, but the evidence just doesn't support the idea that training it alone leads to meaningful improvements in reading and math for kids.
Right, that far transfer that everyone's hoping for just doesn't seem to pan out in most of the research.
And that brings us to a final thought for our listeners. Given the time and money that people are spending on these programs, what other approaches to supporting children's learning might be more effective?
Right, if working memory training isn't the magic bullet we thought it was, what else can we do to help kids succeed?
Maybe we need to focus more on developing specific skills, providing high-quality instruction, creating supportive learning environments, addressing underlying issues like anxiety or attention problems.
Those are all great points. And, it's really important to critically evaluate the claims being made about these programs and to think carefully about how we're investing our resources to support children's learning.
Because at the end of the day, we want what's best for kids, and that means following the evidence and making informed decisions.
Thanks for diving into this research with me. It's been really eye-opening.
My pleasure. Always happy to explore these important topics.
And for our listeners, we encourage you to keep those questions coming. Send us your research, and we'll deep dive into it together.
Until next time, keep learning.
And keep thinking critically.